used to, several years ago, belong to the choir back in New York, and I really learned to enjoy a different kind of music that I hadn't learned to appreciate prior to having joined the chorale. I think I finally determined that baritone voices are some of my favorite voices to listen to in terms of music. And I guess also in terms of speaking or whatever. There's just something about them, the power, the depth, the fullness, the richness that I really enjoy. Mr. Quillen mentioned some of the things, I guess, about the meeting that we had last Sabbath evening. Actually, it was after the Sabbath we got started about 5 o'clock with the teens. I thought I just might mention a couple of things with respect to that, since we did spend quite a bit of time just sort of sitting and chatting, rapping, as it were, I guess is the common vernacular, as well as devouring hamburgers and potato salad and all sorts of other goodies, some hot cider. I think everybody rather enjoyed themselves, and everybody seemed to have been full when we left. Nobody wanted more or whatever. But I know that, we talked about several different kinds of things that evening, and it was kind of enlightening and enjoyable, as I mentioned. We talked about drug problems as kids face them at school, and the problems that they do have with it, that is, with the other kids that are there, and how there's actually the campus situation is. And I perhaps learned a little bit more about it myself. When I was going to school, the big things were, I guess, drinking and smoking. And, that was it. That was about all there was. And I guess what others went to school was a matter of smoking and sneaking a cigarette in the boys' bathroom or girls' bathroom or down the corner in the hall somewhere. The kids are a little bit more worldly wise, you might say, today, and they're after other things. And most of the kids mentioned that grass or pot or marijuana, depending upon which one you assign the name of a particular little weed to, it's pretty much common in most of the areas. And most of our kids, I was really kind of glad at the responses that they gave in terms of being able to deal with it, to handle it, and to be able to resist it as they do, and to be able to sort of bring to themselves friends who weren't part of that group, and yet, as I mentioned perhaps later on, also perhaps be able to at least be friendly towards any and everyone who's at school, and consequently not bring upon their heads some of the other problems that they otherwise could, being a castaway or a cast out or looked upon as being the next thing to be picked on. I thought I might dispel one thought that might be in the minds of some parents. YOU, has come on real strong in about the past year and a half, 2 years or so. It's going to be, it's going to be great and excellent and wonderful for our teenagers, and I believe it is. As a teenager in God's church, I would have loved to have had a YOU. We didn't have. Instead, I sort of had to make my own way, as most of us who came along at that particular time in the church did. And we suffered some pains and some sorrows, but I'm not sorry for any of them that I went through, really. But one thing YOU is not going to do, and this may help relieve some parents, YOU is not going to replace, or seek to replace, or try to replace parents, or parents' positions. So any of you parents who maybe had a little tinge of fear or wondering, boy, we're going to take your kids off and teach them and bring their loyalties all towards us and try to take your position, we're not going to do that. I mean, Mr. Quillen and I both are very strongly convinced that there is nobody on the face of this earth who ought have the rapport, the position, the responsibility that God has given of a parent with his children or with her children. So moms and dad, we're not going to take over. I say that perhaps to those parents who feared that we might, and maybe for those few parents who wished that we might. Not really. Hope there are no parents like that. But we're going to try to work with and try to provide opportunities for those young people and give them outlets for a lot of their energies. We all are social creatures, and to my chagrin, I heard of one family, I guess this past week, my wife was telling me, one of the families who have children at the school where she teaches, her mother came in and said that she did not allow her children to play with other children because she wanted to rear them up the right way. She didn't want any other kids messing up her little gems and jewels. So her children's, I guess, social activities consist of riding their tricycles around inside the house so they don't become tainted or infected by whatever all the rest of us or the rest of our children or whatever have. And it's really too bad, because being social creatures, we do need to sort of interact with our peers to one degree or another. We do need to have friends. We are social creatures. God created us that way. And I might just mention that with regard to that, it's also mentioned when we mention YOU, when we mention family, sermons about those sorts of topics. But there are an awful lot of people, perhaps in this congregation, who either have no families, have no children, have outgrown their children, don't have contact with their children, or just haven't had them because they're not married. But over in Matthew chapter 19, just briefly, Christ here talking, and in verse 29 of chapter 19 of Matthew, he said, "And everyone that has forsaken houses, or brethren, or sisters, or father, or mother, or wife, or children, or lands, for my name's sake." And all of us, supposedly, as we've committed our lives to God, to His work, fall into this category. We put God first in our lives. And to do that, some of us have had to give up some of the things, or have had to cut off, or be cut off from our parents, our brothers, our sisters, at times our own children, who desire to have nothing to do with us because of the beliefs that we have. But Christ says that to us, to these people, we shall receive 100-fold and shall inherit everlasting life. But the receivership of that 100-fold is what I just kind of wanted to focus in on just for a minute. That we as God's church are building our own little society in a way. We as God's people are a composite group, a part of an entire body that covers the world. It is the worldwide Church of God. And Christ said that those that we had to give up elsewhere, or those who gave up on us perhaps elsewhere, we ought not perhaps grieve and be bereaved over it, because within the church we have children. In the church we have fathers and mothers and friends, more than we had perhaps even prior to coming into God's church. And so as all of us are perhaps mothers or fathers or sisters or brothers, one of another, we each have a responsibility in terms of mutual support, in terms of being able to give to, being able to upbuild, being able to encourage one another. And that includes even our youth. And I say that having already said that nobody can take over the position of parent. And I think as we even go about that job of seeking to encourage one another, particularly our children, we ought to recognize that. If a parent decides that he wants his child to wear blue pants and red shirt, and you don't particularly think that red shirts belong on boys, that's that parent's responsibility, not yours. But still, we can encourage one another, and our kids need our support, and they're looking for our support. I'm beginning to do a term paper. I think I'm going to chosen the topic, I think, of peer pressure on our teens and on our children, and even on adults in the outside world. And I'm sort of the opinion, I know that peer pressure is a real thing. I went through it in ways survived it. But I also have a rather pet feeling, a gut feeling, and I think can be documented by examples that I've seen and I've been through myself, as well as friends that I've had and other people that I've known, that an awful lot of peer pressure is a matter of occasion, of opportunity. Everybody wants to be thought of as being good, normal, okay, accepted, appreciated, loved, not looked upon as being bad. And that's one thing that so many kids can find in their peer groups. They're mutually appreciated. They're mutually respected. A friend will sit down and listen to your, quote, silly little problem. You can share your ideas, perhaps some of your dreams, with a friend. If we can't do that at home with parents, we can't do that with some adults, then of course we're going to flock to our peers. Of course we're going to go to somebody who looks upon us as being normal, intelligent, and something worth our time. But I think that as we give our kids the time of day, and I think most parents, as we saw last Saturday night, do spend some time, obviously, talking with their kids, spending some time chit-chatting and finding out what's on their minds, finding out that they do indeed have brains, they can think, they can reason, they do have real problems that they face every day. And that as we go through those sorts of things, that we can help combat the problem of peer pressure, because I think every child wants, most of all, to be loved and respected by mom and dad. You know, I've seen that time and time again by kids where I thought there was no hope for mom and dad. But when it boiled down to if there were only two people on the face of the earth, if those children wanted to be respected and loved by, and there were only two, it was mom and it was dad. And that's even after those moms and those dads of these particular children had done all sorts of things that you thought would have torn the kids apart. So we are looking for an opportunity perhaps to give to our young people, but it's not going to be a one-way street. Teens, the YOU is not going to be all get and no give. There is going to have to be some giving on the other side. But I think that as adults, and Mr. Quillen and I were talking briefly about this even this past week, but when adults lose the leadership in a country or in a society, we're in trouble. We're talking about it with respect to the school situation, and I know I mentioned an incident at the home where I worked, where seemingly it was the children who were in charge. And the adults were afraid to do anything. And everything the adults did was a reaction from what the kids had already done. And their hands were basically tied because they tied them themselves. And so when adults lose that leadership responsibility, then we're in trouble. And after all, Malachi 4 does say that God in chapter 4 and verse 6 says that He shall turn the heart of fathers to the children. He said the fathers first to the children, and then the hearts of the children come back to the fathers. So oftentimes that will take some doing, that will take some time, but I remember my own personal life, because there had to be some of that turning in my own personal life at age 11 or 12. As I've mentioned more than once, there were times when I felt kind of low and lonely as a 10, 11, or 12-year-old. And there had to be some real changes in my own mind and in my own thinking. But a lot of it was really aided and helped by the attitude that my parents took, improving their loyalty back to me, improving their love back to me, which then allowed me to love them all the more and to respect and appreciate them all the more. There's a book out which doesn't deal with necessarily parent-child relationship, but husband-wife relationships. I don't remember the title of it, but I heard the author speaking the other evening, and it was commented that the best thing a husband can do is buy a woman. The best thing a wife can do to improve their marital relationship is love their mate. Because you get back more often as much, if not more, than you give out. But it's contrary to human thinking. And the same is true of our children in parent-child relationship. But one of the comments that one of the kids made that particular last Saturday evening, and this is, I just might mention what I was mentioning, in terms of we do solicit your support, and we really do hope that you will support YOU and your teenagers, our teenagers, in their endeavors. Another thing I just might briefly mention is that I saw another man on television who was a traveler of world renown, similar to John Goddard, who came over to college. And this man happened to mention about 4 or 5 times in about the 10 minutes that he was sitting speaking about why he felt he had the ability to go on and conquer so many of the things that he did. Because his first dream, he said, was he decided he was going to climb the Matterhorn at age 14. And he felt personally within himself that one of the major reasons that subsequently he was able to go on and do so many things with his own life was that when he told his dad, as he watched his television program, "Dad, I'm going to climb the Matterhorn," that his dad didn't say, "Son, let's go cut the grass, okay? Forget such idiotic ideas. It's a little way out. Don't worry about such things. Let's go wash windows or do the car or do something useful." But he said his dad actually took the time and sat down with him and said, "Oh, really? How do you propose to do that?" And his dad took his dream or his hope or his aspiration seriously. And I might ask, how many of us sitting here with Mike Osborne, to select out just one particular dream, had come to us 1.5 years, 2 years ago and said, "I'm going to bike across the United States"? How many of us would have thought that that was within the realm of possibility even? But he did. And it proved to be quite an experience for him, an education, and quite an opportunity. This man felt that the reason he was able to go as far as he went was because his parents were willing to sit down and listen to his ideas, his hopes, his aspirations, not just shoot him right out of the saddle as quick as they came up, but to actually spend time in helping think through the ideas. Now, for some of us, and most of us, perhaps climbing the Matterhorn might not be within the realm of possibility. But before we shoot it out of the saddle, we might spend the time and take the time and sit and talk about it. And say, hey, how do you propose to do that? And then we can add, have you considered this? Have you considered that? And we can give the kinds of direction that hopefully will be the kind of direction that our kids will take and be able to then go ahead and use. But one of the problems that the kids mentioned, or at least a couple of them mentioned, that was one of their major problems, funny that it should be, I guess, was the problem of Sabbath and Sabbath keeping, and the problem of commitment. Commitment to this way of life, which the Sabbath is the test commandment concerning our commitment to God. We show God that we're committed to Him in many different ways, but one of the major ways is by a commandment that He has set, from the time He set it, as being a test commandment whether you will obey or whether you will not obey. And down through Israel's history, and down through the history of man, it has remained a test commandment as to our commitment to the God that we serve. And so in thinking about a topic to discuss this morning, and mulling it over and giving some thought to, I thought it might be worthwhile to just sort of add a few comments concerning the meeting that we had with our youth. I thought about the life of a particular man who I think everybody who knows anything about the Bible has on the tip of their tongue. He's oftentimes the hero of most younger people. I don't know why, perhaps because he's such a man of action, such a man of seemingly such tremendous displays of emotion. And yet as you study the Bible, you find out that most of the men in the Bible were that way. But his man was thought about as being the giant killer. A man some look at and say was an adulterer. A man who others look at and say was a bloody man, a warmonger. And I guess at times in his life he was all of those, and much more. Now I guess you all know we're talking about the man David. But David was a man who was 100% committed to his God. There were no ifs, ands, and no buts. David knew who his God was. He believed that his God was. And that's the way David lived his life. Totally and fully committed. So I'd like to go through perhaps just a couple of character traits, you might say, of the man David, and a couple of his experiences, and how they might apply to us today as we live our lives. I think one of the most well-known stories about David has to do with Goliath, the slaying of the giant. If we can turn back over to 1 Samuel. Because here we find a boy who was perhaps 17, 18 years of age, the age of many of our teenage boys, perhaps slightly older than some, the age of some of our girls, again slightly older than some. But he was a teenager. He was given the responsibility of keeping the sheep for his father. Seemingly he was reasonably unassuming. Seemingly he was not that bodacious or that tremendous an appearing individual. As he walked into the room where here he was coming and he was being looked upon, Samuel was looking for somebody to anoint, and God was going to show him how. He wasn't the kind of individual that Samuel could look and say, "You're the one we've been waiting for." You know it. And as soon as you walked in the room, you know, there's that commercial, when it's right, you'll know it. Well, seemingly, David was not that kind of individual, that on sight, you would know it. But yet and still, I think this example of David and Goliath shows the manner in which the man trusted in his God. The way in which he believed that his God was almighty, that he was all-powerful, and that God indeed heard him when he went to talk to him in prayer, when he sought him out. Starting here in verse, always pick it up in verse 17 or verse 4. Actually, the story runs that David was sent up to the front line to help or to deliver some goods to his brothers. And as he came up to the front line, he began hearing talk as he was talking to his brothers of this huge Philistine, this giant of a man that had been challenging Israel 40 days to just send out one man to fight me. And as you send them out, we'll go to battle, and that will determine who's going to win this war. And the Israelites were in absolute fear and trepidation of this man. And I imagine physically rightly so, because he probably stood at least about 9 feet tall, and he's probably as wide as half of us are tall ourselves, and he was no strength of a man. I played a little bit of football, and we had the not the LA Rams, the 49ers, I guess it were, came over to college here about 4 years ago, and we played a little basketball game against them, and I got a chance to meet some of their interior linemen, none of whom was over, I don't think, that time about 6'6" or so, but some of them weighed like about 250 pounds, and as I put my little frame next to their frame, and my 2 legs next to his 1 leg, I immediately, gained a perspective. He was not the individual that I was going to, give a shot in the ribs. He was not the individual I was going to dare to flick, the chip off my shoulder. He was the individual that I might say, excuse me, please, I want to go this way. Do you mind? Well, none of these men matched in stature Goliath. And so I'd imagine that as these men looked out and they saw this huge man, that they began to think, he's mighty, he's powerful. And that was their failing, that they began to look only at the physical. And that's a problem that we often can have when we begin looking at primarily physical things. But as David came up and he heard what was going on, and he asked around, what's going on? What's happening? What's this man talking about? And he was told, and his brothers even jumped on his back at that time and said, hey, we know what kind of guy you are. You're just out here for the glory. I want you to mind your own business, go back home, you finished, forget it. But this bothered David, that here was a man challenging the people of the God he served. And in David's mind, it was a challenge to God. Not just a challenge to physical individuals, but it was actually a challenge to God. And as we follow down through the story, and we find that David comes over in verse 26 of chapter 17, and he asks, David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to the man that takes away the reproach from Israel? He's asking, look, the king has made all kinds of promises to you guys and my daughter, and you're going to be set up nice and high. Why should this even have to be? Why should the king have to make these tremendous promises just to try to get somebody to go out and accept this challenge? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David believed in his God. When David prayed, I'm sure he felt exactly like Jesus Christ said he prayed, or felt when he prayed. That God, when I pray, I know you hear me. He didn't have to guess. He didn't have to wonder. He didn't have to think. But he knew. And God was always just as close as about a prayer away. As we get down into verse 34, we find out that David perhaps was not a coward in his own right. He writes later on that a righteous man ought to be bold as a lion. But in verse 34, as he's talking to Saul and trying to convince Saul that here, this little 17, 18-year-old kid desires the right to go out and face this giant, he says, well, look, give me an opportunity, because I used to keep my father's sheep, and when a lion came, or a jaguar, and a bear, to take a lamb or took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after him, and I smote him, and I delivered him out of his mouth. When he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and I smote him, and I slew him. To me, that takes living, walking, believing faith. I tend to be the kind of individual who projects myself into sort of different situations. And I remember thinking when Jaws, actually before Jaws came out, because I used to always be interested in sharks anyway. And I also enjoyed swimming in the beach. And I used to wonder, what would I do if I were out swimming in the ocean and a shark began to approach me? I'd read all kinds of books and read all kinds of articles and all kinds of magazines saying what you should do. Keep perfectly still, bend over and don't try not to move very fast. Don't strike at the animal, do strike at the animal, all kinds of different things. But I remember reading one that said the most tender area on a shark's body is his nose. And it said that if you went to hit a shark, say anywhere else on his skin, that the covering that he has that is scale-like, but not seemingly really true scales, are so abrasive that they'd actually cut your skin. And so you bleed, and when you bleed, sharks smell blood, and they can go into a blood frenzy. But there's one particular area right around his nose that doesn't have those scales on it. And what this author said is if you've got anything, and you see that he's really making a rush at you, give him a poke right there. Now, there's only one problem with that, and the author mentioned the problem, because the way a shark is built, you know, his nose is not like ours, straight up and down like this, but it sort of slants in at a slant. And his nose is here, and right about here is his mouth. So if you hit him at a little bit wrong angle, your hand conceivably could sort of just into his mouth. And I remember thinking about that, and I said, wow. But then I said, well, if that's my only chance a hand to save the body, I guess. You know, the Bible talks about better to enter the kingdom lame, missing a hand, than not get there at all, because you didn't use the hand, or because the hand offended and caused to taint the whole body. But in thinking about that, it sort of led me back here to David, and realizing that here was a lamb. You know, I mean, so what? Lion, eat your lamb, just don't come back. Could be an easy way to figure it. But David felt so responsible about the lamb that he was watching over. Undoubtedly was a man, as I mentioned before, of deep emotion, and had a feeling for the lambs that he was keeping, the flock of sheep. Sheep tend to be the kinds of animals that need emotional give to them. They tend to respond to that. They're not typically like horses or cattle or whatever, but they tend to be the kinds of animals that must be led, must be treated warmly, must be shown some sort of affection or love, or outgoing concern or consideration for, and then respond like to that. But it so infuriated David here that this wolf or this jaguar or this bear came in and took this lamb, that he went after it. Now, I'm sure he didn't go after it just knowing, you know, I've been working out with Joe Weider's barbells now, or Charles Atlas's course, and I can swim pulling 1,500 boats full of all kinds of kids, and I'm so strong and mighty. I'm sure that on the way, David said, God help me. And that's probably the only reason David went after that bear or that jaguar. Because he realized that God was real to him. That sitting out there whittling Philip. And he went after a lion. He went after a bear. To me, that takes an awful lot of faith. It takes an awful lot of conviction to do something of that nature. And as we continue on down and move over to verse 45, we find the same David, who begins to now approach this Philistine. And it says, Then said David to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield. David did not deny the other man's prowess. He didn't say, You're a weakling, you have no ability, you have nothing with which to hurt me. He said, Look, you've got your tools. You have your shield, you have your spear, you have your sword. But he said, I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, and the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. David took his action with God as his foundation, with God as the core of everything that he did. And we likewise need to have that kind of conviction. We need to develop it. We need to grow in that kind of faith. Hebrews 11:6 says that no man can please God except first he believes that he is. And that's a powerful statement right there. To believe that God is. I don't mean to believe that he is. I mean to believe that he is. That he really is. And that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. David believed God. And because he believed God, he was able to take many of the actions that he took. And as you read through the life of David, all the way through 1 Samuel here, and then the 2 Samuel, and beginning of 1 Kings, you see time and time and time again, David went and sought God. David sought the counsel of God's priests. David was continually praying, and seeking what did God have to say. Because he wanted to do God's will. And he knew that if he asked according to God's will, God would answer. And we serve that same God. And whether we be teenagers, as David was when he slew Goliath, or whether we be Ancient of Days, I guess is one term that the Bible uses, we all serve that same God. And that same God is as ready to help us as he was to help David. All that we have to do is know that God, have that close contact with him, and be ready to go to him at a moment's notice. Let's turn just briefly to some of the prayers that David here used. In Psalm chapter 20, which again show David's conviction for his God. In verse 6 of Psalms 20, David says, "Now I know that the Eternal saves his anointed. He will hear him from his holy heaven with the saving strength of his right hand. Some trust in chariots, and some in horses. But we will remember the name of the Lord our God." So whenever there was a problem that came up in David's life, whenever there was a situation that he had to face, David's first reaction was to go to his God. Because David believed that God would hear him. And David believed that God would deliver him. And God did, as long as David was doing what he was to do. Psalm chapter 31. David here confessing, says in verse 22, "For I said in my haste, I am cut off from before your eyes. Nevertheless, you heard the voice of my supplications when I cried to you." David seemingly had gotten himself now in a position where he was so down that he thought, I've been cut off from God. God doesn't hear me. And I know I've been in situations like that where I began to wonder, does God hear what I'm saying? Does God care anymore? Or have I just completely broken off? And am I just too bad for God to recoup? We can get depressed like that. And Satan would love for us to remain depressed like that. But you know, there's one thought that came back into my mind, and I took it back to God. After I thought about it for about a day or so, and I began kind of musing in my own mind, and I said, wait a minute. If God really doesn't hear me, and has cut me off, then I'm a lost cause, as it were. But is God going to give up on me? I really didn't think He would. And I think our Bible shows that God's not going to give up on us. We are the ones who give up on God. And what it made me stop and realize was that if we repent and we go back to that God, and what I actually did, just to share kind of a personal feeling at that time in my own life, I went back and I told God, I said, God, if you don't want me, you're going to have to cut me off. You're going to have to slam the door in my face. Because I'm going to knock and knock and knock and knock and knock. Because I don't have any place else to go. And neither do any of us. God is our total answer. He is our only answer. And at those times when perhaps we do reach a low ebb, or perhaps we begin to wonder, or perhaps we begin to think, God doesn't care. As long as we care, God cares. God wants us in His family. He wants us in His kingdom. So He wants us to develop the commitment, the character that we need to ultimately receive that Godhead. David believed his God. He sought his God with his whole being. And God Himself called David a man after His own heart. And each of us can be like David. And we ought really seek God with our entire being. Another particular quality of the man David that kind of impressed me as I read through it, I've already mentioned a couple of times, David's tremendous depth of feeling of emotion. We live in an age now that we get lambasted from side to side We've been bounced around and our emotions have been joggled, they've been fried, they've been filed with a rasp. And we live in a tremendously cynical nation anymore. A nation that some have deemed a nation of loneliness, where people just sort of pull into their own little holes, and that's it. We have no desire to trust because we can't trust. We have no desire to make deep, lasting friendships because who knows, we may move tomorrow. Or they may turn on us later on and it may hurt. Or for whatever reasons. And we, even in God's church, to one degree or another, have been lambasted by those same things. We've seen people leave the church. We've been hurt by one another. But there's another lesson that I think we learned rather early, and that is, you can't love without being hurt. As long as you're loving human beings, as long as you're loving people, you will be hurt. And I wonder how often God perhaps sheds a little tear, or perhaps wrings his hands a little bit, or gets a little anxious, or perhaps even deeply hurt when we don't do quite what we know we should. Jesus Christ was hurt when he walked the face of the earth here. He cried over a city of people that ultimately stoned him, or rather hung him. Children. I think every parent recognizes that with a child, there are going to be times of pain. Times when the child doesn't quite do what it is. But we know he knew better. And it hurts. There might be a broken arm, or there might be a lacerated head. And that hurts a parent. They don't realize that, kids. It does. They don't like seeing you hurt, whether it be emotionally, mentally, or physically. They don't like it. And even with our friends. David was a man who was said to have loved a friend that he had more even than he loved any woman. That man was Jonathan, Saul's son. They had a relationship that was so deep, that was so strong, that Jonathan was even working actually against his father in a sense, for David, as Saul was seeking David's life. It was a relationship that saved David's life more than once. And as I read again through the entirety of the book, here, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, and about the life of the man David, I sort of get the feeling that David was an outgoing individual. The incident with the lamb. That David was an individual concerned about other beings, even a little four-legged being. But that he was concerned also about people. And don't we have a proverb that says if a man wants friends, he ought to show himself friendly? And so we, again, in copying, or as in showing that we have the same kind of character, the same kind of characteristics that David had, need also to develop friends. And I think we heard a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, the fact that it's normal. Let me put it like this. There are usually a couple of extremes. And I guess there can only be two extremes. One to one side, one to the other. But usually the extremes go like this. There are people who desire to let everything out to everybody they come in contact with. They share their deepest, most intimate goings on in their lives with almost anybody who will bend an ear. Then there are people who won't share any of the inside of themselves with anybody, regardless. Neither of those is the extremes that God's looking for. Jesus Christ had a friend that he felt was an extremely close friend in John. We've mentioned now David, and I dare say that those men sat and talked out things that were really deep. They shared their fears. They shared their anxieties. We have accounts of David and Jonathan sitting down and working out how they were going to work through the problem of Saul seeking David's life. That Jonathan was to do certain things, and then David was to do certain things. And it's tremendously encouraging as we visit around in this area, and we find people, and I'm sure most of us are very typical in this way, who can say, I was having such and such a problem that was really getting to me. And I was able to call so-and-so, a real close friend of mine. And we were able to ask her to, or tell him or her about it, and we could pray together about it. And she encouraged me, she helped me, she stuck with me, and together it was a matter of overcoming whatever the problem, the difficulty was. Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes that two are better than one, because when one falls, the other one's there to help pick you up. And he said that three were even yet better. And it's known that one of the strongest geometric figures is indeed a triangle. Not the triangle that we normally think of when we think of social triangle, but a right kind of triangle, where all three are pulling for each other. And so even as we in God's church are seeking to develop those kinds of relationships, let's not be fearful of the fact that indeed we need to commit ourselves one to another. We spoke of YOU. The commitment that God, or Jesus Christ, while He was here, said that we are family. We are family one to another. And as family, we need to support and help and build up. And so don't be afraid to extend yourself. And again, birds of a feather do flock together. We've heard that also. And there are going to be certain friends that are going to be closer friends than others. There are friends, then there are friends, and then there are acquaintances. And then there are the people we don't know. But those true and deep and solid friends are the ones that we can go to when we do fall down. Who'll be there to help pick us up. And what we're looking for is not commiserating friends, but friends who will look us dead in the eye and say, hey, this is the way. Not friends who will say, yeah, I know what you mean, boy, oh boy, wow. I just don't understand. But friends who are going to be an aid and a help. And as then iron sharpens iron, we can surely help and sharpen ourselves. And I've always wondered, as you look back through the listing of the mighty men of David, those must have been some kind of guys. The deeds that they pulled off, as they were warriors for David. And yet seemingly, again, were loyal, were steadfast, were solid. And no doubt spent a lot of time, or at least some time, sitting around with a mug of beer or glass of lemonade or whatever it was they were drinking, just sharing and helping and encouraging one another. And we can do that ourselves, because there are times that we do run upon that are difficult. I know at least that, when we're strong, when we think we're strong, sometimes we can get the feeling we have no need for anybody else. Well, it's too bad if we can get ourselves in that position. Because as I heard one man say once, I guess it was Washington who plays with the Lakers, said he didn't want to be thought of as the Cassius Clay or the George Foreman of basketball. Being big and bad and mean was not his thing, because there's always somebody bigger and badder and meaner. You maybe just haven't met him yet. And I tell you, there's a problem somewhere down the line, if you haven't run into it yet, that can be bigger, badder, and meaner than you are. So camaraderie is one of the things that God wants. And I don't mean to deny that there is an individual working out of our own salvation. I don't mean to say that we've got to become a social club where we spend 95% of our time, over at somebody's house with this, and over somebody else's house with that, and over somebody else's house with something else. But we're just talking about building and maintaining the relationships that we have. And not letting a little bit of pain cause us to turn off completely. In reality, that's commitment to God. Because God has given us two great commandments. To love Him with all of our heart and our might. And to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. So we have to love ourselves. We ought to love ourselves because we realize who we are and what we are. And then we do have to love our neighbors, even as God has called us to do. It's kind of interesting to me. Turn over to 1 Samuel, I believe it is, chapter 22. Just a little parallel and sort of aside. But it kind of mentions here, as David is in his flight, he's fleeing all over, in verse 2 of chapter 22, and everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, And everyone that was discontented, almost sounds like us, doesn't it? At one point in our lives, gathered themselves unto him, and he became a captain over them. And there were with him about 400 men. The thing that kind of struck me as I was reading through this for the past week is that, over in 1 Corinthians, and we sang the song to begin with, we talk about not many wise men now are called. And in a sense, God has chosen out, as David was running in exile here, a man without a country. God has called us out as basically sort of a people without a country. Our country is coming. It exists. And in a sense, it's more real than this country because it's going to exist forever. But it's not here yet. We're sort of like David was, running around in the wilderness, and at times being sought. It says that Satan is like a roaring lion after us. And it was because he had his company, and again because he had the confidence and the faith in God and the obedience to God, that David was able to maintain his life as he ran from King Saul, and as he even had his dealings with the Philistines and the Ammonites and all the rest of them involved, as he was sort of making his way through the wilderness round about the area of Israel. So we likewise at times do have to have those kinds of friends. We do have to make that camaraderie. We do have to stick together. We've given the analogy of the buffalo sort of pull themselves together. But we likewise continue to have that kind of love, that kind of desire to help, that kind of desire to serve. And this is where we're talking again about YOU. It's not going to be a one-way street. There are times, YOU members, when you're going to be asked, perhaps, to give of your time, to give of your energy, to give of your effort, to help somebody else. Because you see, most of you didn't go down to Tattletales and make that money. Most of you are not going to be able to go and take inventory. There are an awful lot of people here who are pulling for you, who are desiring to help you, who are praying for you. But we need to give back something too. Because none of God's way is a one-way street. One last example I might use in terms of the need for friendship. There was a time in my college career when the career was almost ended. I remember I was up at summer camp when I got the news. And I just sort of allowed the end of one of my semesters, I believe it was my junior year. No, it was the end of my sophomore year. I allowed myself to really get in a pretty raunchy attitude. I pulled back off into myself, which was kind of unusual for me anyway, but I'd done it. And I allowed my attitude to just get raunchier and raunchier and raunchier and raunchier. And I'm the kind of individual that my attitude affects everything that I do. And so naturally affected my schoolwork, that affected my spiritual, growth and development and all sorts of things. And thankfully I had a friend who kind of pulled me aside toward the end of that year and nailed me to the wall and told me what he thought. And he was right. And I thanked him for it, and he's still one of the closest friends I've ever had. He was one of those friends that I was talking about that we all need to have. And I decided, okay, Ron, you need to turn yourself around and go back in the way that you were initially headed, the way that's right. And so I did what I could, and I sought to do it. And I honestly left college thinking, going to summer camp that summer, that I'd succeeded, maybe. Well, about halfway through summer camp, or a third of the way through, I found out I hadn't succeeded totally. I got my attitude squared away again. I'd gotten back praying and studying as I should have been. But because of my social or scholastic lacks, I hadn't flunked. My GPA was still above where it was supposed to have been, but I put on a pretty poor showing in about 2 or 3 of my most important classes. The final exams and through the last half of the semester. And so because of that, they thought, well, maybe I might be better to sort of take a break. And I felt kind of awful alone. And there's an old song that, when all money's all gone and spent, where are your friends? You find out you haven't any. Nobody loves you when you're down and out. And in some ways I began to sort of half feel sorry for myself. And I didn't tell but about 2 people, I guess, up at summer camp. Through the whole summer camp that I was there, about another 6 weeks, I think 3 people knew that I'd been dropped from college. But they were people I found out and I trusted as being my close friends. And they prayed about it, and they'd ask me about it, and asked me if I'd call. And I thought, wow, boy, I got 2 or 3 people really hanging in with me. And it made me feel kind of good. Then I faced having to come back to college. I wasn't in yet, but I was going to come back because I decided I wanted in, that I'd turn the ship completely around, and that that's what I wanted, and I was going to go after it. I came back, and the closer I got back, I began to think, wow, I wonder what everybody on campus is going to think. And these kind of thoughts are one of the main reasons I'm sharing it with you, because you may find yourself down and out one time, and on the outside, looking in. And you may think, hey, I want to go back, but what is everybody else thinking? What about my name and my pride, and how can I face all those people? And these thoughts sort of went through my mind. And I remember as I drove on campus, as I got back from Moore, Minnesota, the thought really hit me that this was no longer my campus. I wasn't a student, but I wanted to be more than anything else. And I walked, I remember, into the student center. And as usual, when you come back, it's full of freshmen, because they don't know where else to be, the student center. But there came in a group of people that I'd known and a couple of really close friends. And there must have been nothing short of at least a half dozen to 8 kids that came around within the first half hour that I was there, had heard the news, had known what was happening, and who told me. We heard it. We've been praying about it. Now that was good enough. That made me feel rotten enough to first of all doubt my own friends. But there are at least 4 of them who had fasted about it. I hadn't asked anybody. I just thought, you mean these kids are willing to go without food for a whole day to ask God about my getting back into college? Those are the kind of friends, as So Brown was mentioning in the sermonette, that really turn your head around. Really make you think about the kind of friend you ought to be. It really kind of set me straight in terms of not doubting anymore the depth of the friendships we develop, especially in the Church of God. And I'll say especially here, because I've also developed similar friendships in people who weren't even in the church. And in thinking through this, I ran across, one ran through my mind who I'll just never forget, and to this day I have kind of a yearning to get back to Zanesville, Ohio. Because there I had a fellow who was, we were more like 2 peas in a pod, you might say. But he was a guy who was willing, and as it turned out, my family was economically better off than his, which was kind of a reverse to begin with. His family was white, mine was black, still is. But here was a fellow who, to this day, still rings true when I think in terms of friendship and loyalties, and what friendships and what loyalties can do one for another. We just sort of fell together in many different ways, and we were sort of natural friends, I guess. We liked the same things. But it was a kind of relationship that was a give and take, and I know from the few times that we shared and told each other how much we appreciated one another. I never thought I ever did anything to him, that was anything unusual. I know he never thought, and he was surprised when I told him about some of the things he did for me that really kind of hit home. When you walk into a family's house that everybody knows within the family is worse off than you are, and they sit at a table with about 7 or 8 kids, and they put one pot of stew in the middle, and that's it. And they mom dips from the pot, dad's overseas in the service, and it's just a matter of, well, we've got enough to go around, I think. And they willingly and openly say, hey, why don't you stay for dinner? And all the kids say, yeah. you know there's something there that goes deeper than just surface of the skin. And like I say, I think we have those kinds of relationships, but I think it's encouraging as we stop and rehearse through our mind and we think about and we appreciate those kinds of relationships, or develop them perhaps if we don't have them, or if we don't have several of them. For the qualities the man who was said to be a man after God's own heart had. Qualities to develop, the kinds of relationships that stick, the kinds of relationships that are friends. The same proverb that says if a man wants friends, he must show himself friendly, also says, and then you have a friend that sticks closer than a brother. Closer than your own flesh and blood. A friend that's going to be with you to the end. And a friend that you might need one day to pull you up and help keep you going. David was a man who had other characteristics and other qualities also. He was a man who was committed to God's way. Not just to God, but to God's way. And that's important. David was also a man who was active. He took action. And he used whatever opportunities there were that were around him to continue on his way. Let's turn to chapter 23 of 1 Samuel. Because, sometimes we can get ourselves into the situation where we think, oh, I'm not a such and such, therefore I can't do whatever. But remember, David is a man who's on the run. David is a man without a country, who's been exiled. He's running for his life. Not to mention the fact he's already also been anointed king. I didn't mention that. But he's a man who's running, who's been rejected by the country, or by the leadership of the country, in which he was living. And yet here is David, who yet had his little band of men, who is still taking action to preserve that country. He wasn't just sitting on his thumbs in a cave somewhere, sort of twiddling and wishing, oh, if I were king, I would do this. If I were only a deacon in the church, I would do all these things. If I were only, this is what I'd do. But he saw an opportunity, with little thought, and a little prayer, or maybe much prayer. He took the opportunity. In chapter 23 it says, and then they told David, saying, behold, the Philistines fight against Quillen, and they robbed the threshing floors. And therefore David inquired of the Lord. Again David went to God, saying, shall I go and fight these Philistines? And the Lord said unto David, go and smite the Philistines and save Quillen. And David's men said to him, behold, we're afraid here in Judah. We're already living in the borders of Judah. And they're already fearful for their lives there, for the loyalists of Saul, for their own lives. And he said, how much more than if we were to come to Quillen against the armies of the Philistines? So they're asking David, are you crazy? I mean, not only are we living in a nation that's already hostile towards us, which is, quote, our country, but not our country, because we're exiled from it. But now you're going to say, let's go fight for this country we're exiled from against its enemies? And develop two enemies? You must be crazy. But again, David had sought God, and God said, hey, let's go. And then David inquired of the Lord again. And God answered and said, arise and go, for I will deliver the Philistines into your hand. David again had some vision. David again realized that one day, as he had been anointed, that he was going to be king. And that it was better as king not to have other countries already having run over your own nation. So in a sense, David was already fighting loyally for the country that exiled him. He was not yet king, but he was taking on a responsibility that perhaps the king normally would have done, to protect his own borders. And we in God's church, as I've already mentioned, can get ourselves into sort of funny situations where we think, if I only had, I could do da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But there's not a person sitting in this room that doesn't have something to offer. Every now and then you hear sort of comments, and I guess they can get a little frustrating because we are physical, and because we tend to lose perspective. I think we've all been through it, where we think, or we say, well, all we can really do about it is pray. That's all. We can't really do very much, but we can pray. That's the most you can do about anything. Prayer, beseeching God, because it's God that does the acting, whether it be through you, or the person sitting next to you, or the person 3 rows behind you, or whatever, or whomever. It's God that's going to bring the increase. It's God that's going to work through the action. And so prayer and beseeching God to do the acting is the most important thing any of us can ever do. So we ought to say, well, all I can do is give $500. But that's not all we can do, because we can still pray. So there's not an individual here who doesn't have something to give. Because we can all pray. And most of us in here, and I'll say most purely to cover myself because I don't know of one individual, and prayer is the only thing you have to give. You know, some people are just gifted with the ability to encourage others, to uplift, to give some newness of hope, of direction. That's a gift God's given you. Use it. Some people are talented and gifted in physical ways or in other ways to be able to do certain things. Use those talents. You don't need ministerial sanction to invite somebody over to dinner. You don't need ministerial sanction to give somebody a ride, downtown because they have to go shopping or whatever. There's so many things that we don't need office or position to be able to do and to be able to serve that it's just not funny. Now, I guess right here I should also mention, because there are always two sides, there are always those who are seeking to give as much as they can. And I think most of us are of that bent. We're desiring to give as much as we can and to serve in whatever areas we can. Then there are those who want to be served or think they ought to be served and who are saying, you've got 5 hours from the time you get home from work and I need 2 of them and you're not giving them to me. No, it's not my responsibility to necessarily demand of you your time and service. Again, we get back to the old proverb that says that if a man wants friends, he must show himself friendly. That giving is kind of a two-way street. And as we give, God's law says we're going to get back. So as soon as we get on the side and we begin to worry about they're not giving me all that they should, we need to stop and think for a minute. True enough, they may have a problem, but so do I. Because there's a reason why, perhaps, they're not giving what they should. Because God says again that if you do show yourself friendly, that you will have friends. And that then those friends will be willing to take the time and the energy. It happens in the physical world. Spend the time with you. I have people who are now bending over backwards and taking their time to show me how to work on my car to save me some money in terms of what's going on. And there are guys that are willing to sacrifice and get up at 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning and come over and work with me. Well, yeah, I took a drive down on one particular day and picked up some oil for them. And we don't keep score. We're not saying, well, you did this, therefore now I have to do this, and now we're even. But then you do something else for me, and so now I owe you something. It ought to be just kind of a general flow. But we don't worry about what comes back this way. It's amazing how much will come back. If what we're really worried about is how much we give out the other way. So the opportunity in taking advantage, of the opportunities to do certain things, is again part of the characteristics of the man David. A man after God's own heart. And again, it's part of total commitment. It's commitment to a way of life. Mr. Armstrong has said time and time and time again, God's way is the way of give. That's what we're learning now. That ultimately we're going to be giving. I don't know, beyond 1,000 years or 2,000 years what we'll be giving or where we'll be giving it. But God is give. He's love. He's outgoing concern. If nothing else, we'll be giving to each other. But dare I say, we'll be giving more than even just that. And that's what we're learning now. We're learning to trust God, that as we give, we're learning, hey, it can be fun to even give. Not to mention the fact that I get kickbacks that come back the other way. The woman on television, who I mentioned before, was talking about the best thing a wife can do for her husband is to love him. Was asked the question, well, what would you do if your husband had made a request, set down his foot about something that you really desired to do, and said no? The instance that was brought up was the interview that was there, that she was where she was. What if your husband said, honey, look, you can't go, I need you here? First of all, she said, well, because of the relationship we've established, I don't think he'd do that. But she said then, secondly, that if he did, I wouldn't go. I'd stay home. She said she'd put up maybe a little, and show reasons and maybe cry a little, all the female defenses or offenses or whatever. But she said that if he stuck to his guns, she wouldn't go. And she said she'd love him to pieces so much that he'd next ask her, is there another interview? I'm really sorry I didn't let you go on the last one, please. Can I help you get another one somewhere? Because she's learned the basic law that as you give to other people, that it comes back. That it's one thing that people want, that is to be loved and to love. But people don't like to waste love. And people think of wasting love in terms of when it just goes out. And then they get cut off, they get backstabbed, they get talked about, they get rumored about, they get gossiped about, etc., etc., etc. People want to trust, but people don't think, all too frequently, that they really can trust. A couple more points. I might cover one just kind of briefly. That is the matter of diplomacy, which I think is all kind of interrelated with the last two that we talked about, that David exhibited. Once heard a student say, while I was at college, I guess my freshman year, and I've forgotten who said it initially, but there's a difference between right and righteous. And I took that home that evening, and I kind of thought about it for a little while. And finally I agreed, there is. There is a difference between right and righteous. And I think I made the comment about a week or so ago to somebody that half of wisdom in what we do, or what we say, is in how we say it, or how we do it. I've kind of revised my statistics a little bit. And I think now a third of wisdom in what we say or do is in how we do it, or in how we say it. And a third of it is in the timing involved, or when we say it, or when we do it. And then the third is just the fact of what we do, or what we say. But thoroughly, a third of the wisdom in what we do is in what we say, or rather how we say what we say, or how we do what we do. In this day and age when everybody's talking about my rights, my demands, it's kind of interesting, the idea of when you go into a restaurant, service. And that individual is there behind to serve you, right? And she's getting paid a salary to serve you. So you have a right to expect certain things of her. I almost guarantee you that if you go into a restaurant demanding your rights, your services might not be quite so good. And if you make your demands more vocally, and begin to berate, actually, your waitress, you may find the custard or the soup in your lap, or late meal or cold meat or whatever. Now that person would have a problem. And I agree. they have a job to fulfill, a job to do, and it's their job to do it in the face of whomever it is that comes in. But I'm talking about my responsibility going in. And I've taken basically the tack of, hey, look, she or he have got a responsibility, true. But I consider part of my responsibility handling the situation as diplomatically, as tactfully, as cordially, as enjoyably as I possibly can. See, my desire is to try to make her job as easy as possible. And I found that when you do it that way, you get service that goes through the ceiling. When you ask for pie a la mode, you get a waitress that comes back and says, there's a little extra pie in the dish, and I put a little extra scoop of ice cream on the side here where you need. And I don't have to worry about, well, how come this piece of pie is not as big as, as that piece of pie? Or how come I didn't get this? And they'll take care of you. And it's true in life. As we handle life tactfully, as we handle a relationship with other people diplomatically, we gain favor in people's eyes. There's a proverb that talks about a soft answer turning away wrath. It's a matter of timing, a matter of tact, a matter of diplomacy. But if another individual comes at you and he's all upset, obviously emotionally involved in whatever it is that's upset him, then is not the time, normally, to jump on him with all fours. First of all, find out why he's upset. It could be that he's upset with you standing next to him because he's got a broken toe which you are now standing on. And he would like for you to move. So I'm not talking about diplomacy in a political, scheming kind of way. I'm talking about tact and diplomacy, purely out of the way of having the other fellow's benefit at heart or in mind. And that's what Philippians chapter 2 and verse 4 talks about. Philippians in chapter 2. Ephesians, not Philippians. It says, look not every man on his own things, but every man also. It says also. It doesn't say forget your own thing. It says also on the things of the best interests of others. And when we have the other's best interest at heart, we will be diplomatic. Because the end that we'll be after will be that individual's best. So we'll care about how we say what we say. We'll care about when we say what we say. And we'll care about what we say. Because we'll want to provoke him to good works, not to bad works. Now, if he gives off bad works, he's got a problem. True. But have you got a problem if you provoked him there? Christ talked about woe unto them by which offenses come. And so just a matter of being tactful and diplomatic, you might say what is one of the instances I'll throw out with David was the instance of his choice of Jerusalem as a capital city, which at the time belonged to neither Judah or Israel, and so he conquered it, and so then it became a city, and sort of then neither allowed either of the groupings of tribes or of nations to be jealous one of the other and saying, well, David, you've always been here, or David, you're always there, you favor them instead of us. As king, he had a right to put the capital wherever he wanted. But diplomatically, but tactfully, he chose, because it would be easier on the people, to put it where he put it, at Jerusalem. So our rights sometimes are not the things always to be pressed. Most often, our rights are not the things to be pressed, but the rights of others to take that tack diplomatically. In closing, there's obviously one whole part of David's life which I've sort of left out, which to me was a tremendous lesson. Sort of half covered at the beginning, the first thing, in terms of his trust and his confidence in God, but I think is exemplary. The kind of man that David was, that God could say what he said about him. Consider yourself as perhaps a 17 or 16, 18-year-old fellow, and a man of God comes out to your house. And this man of God pours oil on your head, and he says, you are being anointed as the king of this nation. That puts a lump in your throat first of all. Then he leaves. Then you wind up being a servant in the king's house. Then you wind up being a warrior in the king's army. Then you wind up being a fugitive and an exile from the kingdom. And all the time, you have been anointed king. All the time, you've already had the oil poured on your head. And the man of God, whom David took as the highest authority, has already said, you are this nation's king. And you run around like a criminal for 2, 3, 4, I don't know how many years really was exile. 4 years, perhaps. That's a question I asked several people who thought, at one time or other, that they were being chosen of God as the new leaders in the work. Or they had some new idea the administration just wouldn't look at. Well, David got it straight from God's servant. But David didn't take the matter in his own hands. And again, as you go back and you read through, and I might encourage us all to read back through the life of David. It's not a man naturally to be worshipped or whatever, but I think there are a lot of good examples that we can gain and gather out of his life. But David waited until God took the action. There are times when that patience that David exemplified there is what we need in our service to God. It's part of that total commitment to God. We all get tired. Paul talked about growing not weary with well-doing. We all can very easily get to that stage. I was thinking not too long ago about the people like Magellan or Columbus as they set out on the other side of the ocean on a little bitty old ship, maybe the size almost of the smaller part of the stage, to find the new world. They had a goal that they were after. They didn't know if it was 150 miles, 250 miles, 350 miles. They sailed. They sailed, and they sailed. When they thought they may have found land, it may have been a mirage. What about the settlers that settled this country that you and I share the wealth of? Who started on the East Coast and came across the Alleghenies, who came across the Midwest, who came across the tops of the Rockies. What about the Donner Party that got stuck in a snowstorm and a blizzard right up here in Squaw Valley? But who had a goal, who had a purpose, and who trudged and trudged and trudged till they either died or they made it. What about the signs on the side of wagons, Oregon or bus? That's the guts of what this nation was built on, carnally and physically. And that was just for a physical nation. We're after something that's a whole lot more than that. And okay, we don't know exactly how far it is to get there. But is getting there worth it? I was reading another author who was a psychologist who was talking about willpower. Who was comparing willpower and saying what we need is more want power. In a way I kind of agree with some of the things that she said, in a way I don't. But she basically defined want power as a matter of having a goal in mind. So that when you make yourself do something, it's for a reason of virtuing a goal. It's not just because it's something to do. We all have a goal in mind. Everything God asks us to do, Every experience basically that we go through in life can direct us and lead us either to continue along towards that goal or can derail us off and away from that goal. Does the going ever get too tough? It gets awful tough. As I mentioned, there were times when I thought about just quitting and giving up. Why bother? At that point in time, I thought it was me that was the biggest problem and God wasn't big enough to forgive me. But we learn about that. There are times when we sweat. Not too many of us, I don't think, have bled yet. But we may in the future. But the goal is there. David waited patiently for it. His life was in danger. Ours may be. The same God that helped David overcome Goliath, the same God that led Israel victorious in all their battles through the reign of David, is the same God that's going to lead us victorious to ultimately become His very sons, as long as we remain 100% committed to God and to God's way of living. As we're developing these kinds of characteristics that man, who was a man after God's own heart, had in his very life. I think we all plan to be there. I know that if we all give 100% committal, we all will be there.
Additional programs and literature available at hwalibrary.com.